My name is Renata Cowell. I'm 34 years old, and the night that changed everything, I was standing in a stranger's bathroom, staring at my own reflection in a mirror that probably cost more than my first car, trying to decide whether what I had just heard was something I was allowed to be destroyed by. The answer was yes, it absolutely was, but I didn't know that yet. What I knew was that my hands were shaking slightly, and I was holding a glass of wine I hadn't drunk, and somewhere on the other side of that door, my husband was laughing at something Todd Birch had just said, and somewhere in the last 4 minutes, he had introduced me to that room, to the people whose respect he had spent 6 years trying to earn, as his babysitter. Not his wife. Not the woman who worked 3 jobs so he could study. Not even a friend. His babysitter. Like I was a girl he used to pay to watch his dog. I set the wine glass down on the edge of the sink, very carefully, the way you put something down when you're afraid of what you'll do if you're not careful. And I looked at myself in that mirror, and I thought, okay, so this is what it is. But before I tell you how we got to that bathroom, I need to ask you something. If you've ever worked yourself into the ground for someone who quietly decided you weren't worth the full version of their story, you're going to understand every word of what I'm about to say. Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know who's up with me for this. Okay, let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Beckley, West Virginia, which is the kind of place where everyone knows your name, but half of them have already decided what it means. My mother raised 3 kids in a rented house near the train tracks on what she made doing laundry at a hospital. Not the nice kind of hospital laundry, the kind where you feed industrial sheets through a machine for 8 hours and come home with your hands cracked to the knuckle. She was not a soft woman. She was not a warm woman, not in the way the word usually means. But she was there, every morning, every school form, every school lunch. Whatever else I grew up without, I never grew up without her being present, and I didn't fully understand until I was older what it cost her to do that. My father left when I was 9. No conversation, no goodbye that I remember. One morning he was there, and then slowly, over the course of a week, he wasn't. My mother did not explain it. She did not cry about it in front of us, or if she did it somewhere I couldn't see. What she said was, "We're still here, and that's what matters." And I believed her. I made myself believe her so completely that for years I thought not needing people was a skill I had mastered. It wasn't. It was a wall I had built and learned to call a window. I had a brother, Caleb, 2 years younger than me, and a little sister, May, who was 7 when I left for college. Caleb was easy and funny and mostly fine. May was the one I worried about. She was quiet in the way that meant she was watching everything and filing it away to deal with later. I recognized the pattern because I'd invented it. What I learned growing up in that house was this: the person who asks for the least gets given the least. My mother spread what she had across what screamed the loudest. I learned not to scream. I learned to manage. I learned that there was a specific kind of pride available to the person who doesn't need anything from anyone, and I collected that pride like it was something I could spend later. I couldn't. That's not how it works. I was the first person in my family to go to college, Marshall University, on a partial scholarship and a Pell Grant, and whatever I could make evenings at a Panera. I studied business administration, concentration in accounting, because numbers made sense to me in a way that people sometimes didn't. Numbers didn't revise themselves, didn't decide they meant something different based on who was looking at them. I graduated in 5 years, not 4, because in my junior year my mother had a health scare, and I dropped to part-time to be closer in case something happened. Nothing serious happened, eventually, but I'd already lost the semester. I was offered a full-time position at Hargrove and Dean Associates in Charleston 6 weeks after I passed my final exams. Senior bookkeeper. It was not glamorous. It was not what people picture when they picture success, but I was good at it immediately. And there is something in being immediately good at something that settles a particular anxiety you've been carrying your whole life. The year I started at Hargrove, I also paid off the last of my student loans. I was 23 years old. I know that's not something that happens much anymore. I'm not saying it to impress you. I'm saying it because it matters for what comes later. The habit of financial precision, the habit of documentation, the habit of knowing exactly what is owed and to whom. I met Dominic at a birthday party I almost didn't go to. A mutual friend, a woman I haven't spoken to in 3 years now, for reasons that will become clear. He was 26, tall, recently rejected from his first medical school application cycle, and already reframing it as a strategic pause rather than a failure. He was charming in the way of people who have been rewarded for their whole lives for being charming. He asked me questions about my work and seemed genuinely interested in the answers, which was unusual. He had a seriousness underneath the charm that I mistook, at the time, for depth. We dated for a year. He proposed the week he got his second application cycle acceptance. It felt, at the time, like a beginning. I want to be honest with you about something. I knew, even then, that I would be the one who managed things. I knew it the way you know a fact before you've decided how you feel about it. Dominic was gifted and driven and utterly incapable of tracking a budget. His parents had money, not enough to fund medical school comfortably, but enough that he'd never had to think about money the way I had. He didn't track what things cost. He didn't track what he owed. Not maliciously, he just didn't. I told myself that was fine. I told myself it was a difference in background, not a difference in values. I told myself a lot of things that were technically true and fundamentally misleading. When Dominic started medical school, I sat down and did the math. His loans, our rent, his living expenses, my living expenses, the gap between what his subsidized loans covered and what life actually cost. I added a line item for unexpected expenses because I was 24 and already knew that unexpected expenses were not actually unexpected. They were just unscheduled. Then I found the second job. The UPS distribution center hired me for weekend shifts, sorting, loading, moving boxes from one conveyor to another for 6 hours at a stretch. The pay was decent. The hours were 5 a.m. to 11 a.m. on Saturdays and Sundays, which meant I was home by noon and could still spend the afternoon doing the remote data entry work I'd picked up from a dental billing company that needed someone consistent and fast. I was both. I want to tell you what it actually felt like. Not the brave version, not the self-sacrificing version, the real version. It felt like I had made a decision and I was going to honor it because that's what I do. It felt like my hands hurt more than they used to. It felt like I was very tired some mornings and I didn't say so. It felt like when Dominic said, "I don't know how you do it," I wanted him to know how I did it. I wanted him to understand the mechanics, the cost of it. And instead I said, "I'm fine, go study." Because I thought that was love. I thought love was the thing you did without making anyone feel the weight of it. I was 30 years old before a woman named Petra Novak, sitting across from me at a break room table at Hargrove and Dean, said to me flatly, "You know it's okay to say when something is hard, right? It doesn't make it less true that you did it." I didn't know what to do with that sentence, so I wrote it on a Post-it and put it in my desk drawer and looked at it on the days when I needed something to hold on to. That sentence is going to matter later, too. The years of medical school passed the way hard years do. Not quickly, not slowly, but in a kind of compressed intensity where you stop measuring time in months and start measuring it in milestones. First-year exams, second-year boards, match day. The white coat ceremony, which I have already told you about, where I stood in the third row and cried in a way I didn't fully understand until later. I was crying because it was over, not because it was beginning. I didn't let myself know that at the time. What I let myself know was that we had done it. That word, we, was doing an enormous amount of structural work in my internal life during those years, holding up a version of the story where two people had built something together. I needed that word. I had organized my sense of self around it, so I kept using it, even when the evidence was beginning to suggest that Dominic had a different pronoun in mind. The first sign was small enough to explain away. His match day, the day you find out which residency program has accepted you, which city you'll be moving to, which version of your future has been decided. He called his parents before he called me. He called them while I was at the UPS dock. I found out from a text. We matched at Mercy Regional. Call me when you're off. I read it standing next to a conveyor belt with a box of somebody's holiday shipment in my hands, and I made myself feel happy about the exclamation point, and I called him on my break, and he was already talking about his parents flying in to celebrate. There was no mention of what I had done to get us there. Not an omission born of cruelty, just an omission. The way you don't mention the foundation of a building when you're describing the view from the window. I told myself, he's excited. People don't inventory their gratitude in moments of excitement. That's normal. That's fine. It was not fine. But I was very good at the sentence, that's fine. Residency started and something shifted in Dominic that I watched happen slowly enough that I kept thinking I was misreading it. He was busy. Residents are genuinely, brutally busy, and I knew that, and I gave him every accommodation that knowledge afforded. But busyness doesn't explain the way he started answering my questions about his day with the specific brevity of someone who has decided the person asking doesn't need the full answer. Busyness doesn't explain the watch. It was a Tissot. He came home with it on a Tuesday, and when I noticed it and asked about it, he said it was a gift from his parents for finishing his first year. I said that was nice. I didn't ask what it cost. I had trained myself over years of managing money carefully and watching him not manage it, to not ask questions that would make him feel surveilled. I understand now that this restraint was not wisdom, it was accommodation. And accommodation, applied consistently in one direction, eventually stops looking like generosity and starts looking like permission. 2 months before the dinner at Dr. Harn's house, Dominic moved his wedding ring to his right hand. He said the left bothered him during procedures. I looked at his right hand. The ring was there. I told myself, that's fine. I need to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it, because I think a lot of you watching this have been in some version of what I'm describing. Not necessarily a marriage, not necessarily this specific dynamic, but that particular experience of watching someone quietly revise you out of the story you thought you were both in, of making yourself smaller, not because anyone asked you to, but because you could feel that your full size was becoming inconvenient to someone else's picture of themselves. Have you ever been in that position, where you could feel yourself being edited in real time, and you told yourself it wasn't happening? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know I'm not the only one who's been fluent in the language of, that's fine, when absolutely nothing was fine. Because here's what I know now that I didn't know then. The editing doesn't start at the big moments. It starts so small you can barely see it. It starts with a watch, and a ring on the wrong hand, and a text instead of a phone call. And then one Thursday night in October, it arrives fully formed in a room full of people who have no idea they're witnessing it. The dinner at Dr. Sylvia Harn's house was, on its surface, a quarterly social event. 12 people, a craftsman house in the Terrace Hill neighborhood, good wine, the kind of easy conversation that happens when everyone in the room is performing competence for everyone else. I was the only person there who worked in accounting. I was the only person who had loaded boxes at 5 a.m. I was wearing a dress I had bought 18 months earlier and never worn because I had been waiting for an occasion that felt worth it. I thought that night was worth it. Dominic moved through the room with a fluidity I had not seen in him before. Or maybe I had seen it and hadn't understood it. He was funny in the right places, deferential to the attendings in a way that read as charming rather than sycophantic, and he touched the small of my back twice in the first 20 minutes. Twice. I noticed because it had been a while. Todd Birch was the hospital administrator. Broad, mid-50s, the kind of man who treats every room like a room he's already in charge of. He turned to me at some point in the first hour, in the way people turn to the person standing next to someone important, and asked how I knew Dominic. I opened my mouth. And Dominic said, "Oh, she was kind of my babysitter for a while." A small laugh. "Old family friend. She kept my life together while I was in school." He turned back to Todd. The sentence was finished. The room adjusted. Conversation continued. I stood inside it. I want to be precise about what that moment felt like, because I think precision matters here. It did not feel like being slapped. It did not feel like a dramatic rupture. It felt like the floor had not changed at all, but I had suddenly become aware that I had been standing on something thin, that the thing I had been calling solid ground had been, for some time, a decision Dominic had been making, quietly, to keep building it or stop. He had stopped, and I was the last one to know. I excused myself to find the bathroom. I didn't need the bathroom. I needed 45 seconds alone in a room with a door that locked. I stood in Sylvia Harn's guest bathroom. White subway tile, a diffuser on the counter that smelled like cedar and something floral, a mirror framed in unlacquered brass. And I put my wine glass down very carefully on the edge of the sink, and I looked at myself. The woman in the mirror was wearing a teal dress she had been saving for a night she wanted to be proud of. Her hair was down. She had made an effort. And she was doing the specific kind of math you do when the numbers are coming out in a way you don't want them to come out, but you cannot argue with. 3 jobs, 6 years, admin 47-D, 4,000 times, $42 mason jar on a shelf at home that I have never explained to anyone. Babysitter. I thought, is it possible he forgot? Is it possible he panicked, said something stupid, didn't mean it? And then I thought, he didn't hesitate. There was no stumble, no recovery. The sentence came out smooth and finished. It had been rehearsed. Not for tonight specifically. Rehearsed over time, in the quieter version of his story, the one he'd been telling himself and apparently others, for long enough that it came out without friction. This was not a slip. This was a reveal. I picked up my wine glass. I unlocked the door. I went back out. And I sat down in the only open seat in the room, which happened to be next to Dr. Sylvia Harn. Sylvia was not what I expected, which was foolish of me. I had built an idea of her from Dominic's descriptions, which were admiring in the way you admire someone you are also slightly afraid of. In person, she was warm in the way that precise people sometimes are warm, not effusive, not performing it, but genuinely interested in what you were saying. She asked about my work with a specificity that told me she had actually heard Dominic mention it at some point, though clearly not in the terms I would have used. She asked about the accounting, about the civil engineering projects, about whether I had considered going for my CPA. Someone told me I should, I said. Twice. I keep not doing it. She looked at me for a moment and said, "You should do it." It was such a simple sentence. It should not have meant what it meant. But I had spent 6 years being the person who made things possible for someone else. And here was this woman, who didn't know me, who owed me nothing, looking at me like I was someone with a future worth directing. Like I was a person with a trajectory, not just a history. Across the room, Dominic was watching us talk. I did not look at him. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I silenced it. Petra. The notification sat there, and beneath it, a text. "I need to tell you something. Call me when you're out. It's about the hospital lunch thing. I should have told you sooner." I read it twice, then I put my phone away. Then I finished the wine I'd been carrying all evening. I was very calm by then. That's the thing about certain kinds of clarity. They arrive not with noise, but with an absence of noise. A quieting. The moment when something you have been almost knowing for a long time finally decides to be known. On the drive home, Dominic said the dinner went well. He said Sylvia seemed to like me. He said, "See, it wasn't a big deal." I said, "What did you mean when you said I was your babysitter?" He paused, a pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell me he had been waiting for this question and had prepared an answer for it. "I just meant you took care of things," he said. "Ren, don't make it weird. It was a joke." I looked out the window at the streetlights passing. I thought about Petra's text. I thought about the watch. I thought about the ring on the wrong hand. I thought about 6 years of admin 47-D at midnight, and the UPS dock in January, and the mason jar on my shelf. I did not say anything else. I was doing math. Not the financial kind. The other kind. The kind where you add up what you have been telling yourself and subtract what is actually true, and you sit with what remains. What remained was not small. I called Petra the next morning. Not that night. That night I needed to be alone with what I knew, to let it settle without anyone else's voice in it. I sat at the kitchen table after Dominic went to sleep, and I did not clean anything, which for me is significant. I did not organize a single drawer. I just sat there in the quiet with a glass of water I didn't drink, and I let myself think the word I had been not thinking for 18 months. Over. Not as a decision yet, as a recognition. The way you recognize a smell from childhood, not choosing to remember it, just suddenly knowing exactly what it is. I called Petra at 7:45 in the morning, from my car, parked in the Hargrove and Dean lot, 10 minutes before my shift started. She answered on the second ring. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I kept thinking it was one thing. And then last night you texted me that you were at that dinner and I should have told you." 2 months earlier, Hargrove and Dean had catered a lunch event at Mercy Regional. A professional development thing, the kind of event that fills a conference room with name tags and mediocre sandwiches. Petra had gone to represent the firm. Dominic had been there. She had been standing near the coffee station when she heard him. Not eavesdropping, just close enough. He was talking to another resident, a man she didn't know, and he was describing his domestic situation in the way people do when they're trying to seem uncomplicated. "I've got a girl I used to know from Beckley. She's been helpful while I've been in residency." Past tense. A girl I used to know. Not his wife, not the woman he came home to. A girl. Past tense. From Beckley, which in the context of that hospital, in that room, was its own kind of diminishment. Petra had stood there with her coffee and made a decision not to walk over to him, because she understood, with the precision of a woman who has been through her own version of this, that confronting him in that moment would do nothing except warn him. She waited. "She should have told me sooner," she said again. She had been hoping she was misreading it. "You weren't," I said. "I know," she said. "I know." We sat on the phone in silence for a moment, not an uncomfortable silence, the kind that happens between two people who are both looking at the same thing and don't need to describe it to each other. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going to be very precise." That afternoon, I called a family law attorney named Diane Marsh, whose name I had gotten from a legal directory online and whose website used the phrase "financially complex divorces" in the third line of her bio. That phrase was what I needed. I made an appointment for the following Tuesday. I want to tell you what I brought to that appointment because I think it matters. I brought a folder. Not a manila folder with a few pages stuffed in it, a structured, tabbed document folder with 6 sections. Section 1, 3 years of joint tax returns. Section 2, my individual income records across all 3 jobs, including the UPS pay stubs I had kept in a shoebox for reasons I couldn't have articulated at the time. Section 3, our joint bank statements from the full period of his medical school enrollment, with my deposits highlighted in blue. Section 4, a handwritten document, my handwriting, dated, with the running total of what I had contributed in direct financial support over 6 years. The number was not small. Section 5. The unsubsidized loan interest I had paid during his deferment period, which also was not small. Section 6. A single printed page with a legal concept written at the top. Financial contribution to a professional degree during marriage. And a few notes below it. Diane Marsh looked at my folder for a long moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "How long did it take you to put this together?" I said, "About 4 hours. I keep good records." She almost smiled. "I can see that. I am not going to pretend that meeting was easy. It was not easy. There is a particular grief in sitting across from an attorney and describing your marriage in the language of assets and contributions, in reducing 6 years to figures on a page. But I had spent 6 years reducing love to logistics so that Dominic could become who he wanted to become. And I understood, finally, that precision was not the opposite of feeling. It was what I had instead of the luxury of falling apart. The night before I told Dominic I wanted a divorce, Petra came over. She brought food I didn't ask for, a container of soup, a loaf of bread, the specific combination of someone who has lived alone long enough to know what people forget to do for themselves when they're in the middle of something hard. She set it on the counter and didn't make a thing of it. We sat at my kitchen table. She didn't ask me if I was sure. She didn't ask me if I had thought it through. She already knew the answer to both. Instead, she said, "Is there anything you need me to do?" I said, "Just be reachable tomorrow." She said, "I'll have my phone on the table all day." That was it. That was enough. I drove to Mercy Regional the next morning because Dominic had a short break between rounds at 10, and I had texted him that I needed to see him. He had texted back a question mark. I hadn't answered it. The hospital sat on the east side of the city, a 15-minute drive from our apartment. I had driven that route maybe 40 times over the course of his residency, dropping off food he forgot, picking him up when he was too tired to drive, once sitting in the parking garage for 2 hours because he'd had a bad shift and asked me to wait. I knew every turn. I knew the parking structure on the 3rd level, where the overhead lights buzzed slightly on the east side. I knew the lobby smell, antiseptic and old coffee, and something faintly floral from a cart near the reception desk. I sat in the parking garage for a moment before I went in. Not because I was reconsidering, because I wanted to be still for 30 seconds before I stopped being still. I had the folder with me. He met me in a small family consultation room near the 3rd floor nursing station. Not a dramatic space, just a room with 4 chairs and a table and a box of tissues on the windowsill. He came in already slightly defensive, the way people are when they have been waiting for a confrontation they sensed was coming. He said, "What's going on? I've got 20 minutes. I said, "I know. I won't need that long." I put the folder on the table between us. I didn't open it yet. "I want a divorce," I said. The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of someone recalibrating, running calculations, deciding which version of this conversation gave him the best outcome. "Ren, I have documentation," I said, "of everything I contributed financially over the full period of your medical school enrollment. My attorney has copies." Something moved across his face that I had not seen before. Not guilt, something closer to the thing underneath guilt, the raw place guilt comes from before it gets organized into a feeling. He looked at the folder. "You went to an attorney." "Tuesday," I said, over one comment at a dinner party. And here is where I want you to stay with me for a moment, because this is the part that undid me, not in the way he intended, but in a different way entirely. Because what he said next was, "After everything I've been through, after everything we've built, you're doing this over one sentence?" Everything we've built. We. He was still using the word, Even now, cornered, recalculating, he reached for we as though it were his to use, as though the contribution had been mutual, as though the folder on the table between us did not exist. If you have ever had someone look you in the eye and speak a version of your shared history, in which your part has been quietly deleted, if you have ever felt the specific vertigo of being told that the story you lived is not the story that is being told, then you know what I felt in that moment. And I don't have a word for it that's clean enough to give you. It's not anger, not exactly. It's something that lives just below anger, in the place where you keep the things that are too important to let become loud. Hit that like button if that hit you somewhere real. Subscribe, because what comes next is the part I could not have prepared for. I couldn't have. Because what happened next was the door. It opened. A knock first, a quick professional knock, and then Dr. Sylvia Harn put her head in. She looked at Dominic. She looked at me. She read the room in approximately 2 seconds with the efficiency of someone who has been reading rooms for 30 years. She said, "I'm sorry. I was told this room was available. I'll find another." She was already stepping back. And Dominic said, reflexively, in the tone of a man trying to perform normalcy for his superior, "No, it's fine. It's just, my wife and I were catching up." His wife. Sylvia's eyes moved to me, just for a moment, and I saw her note it. Note the discrepancy between wife in this room and babysitter in her living room 4 nights ago. I saw her file it with the precision of someone who does not discard data. She said, "Of course, take your time," and she closed the door. Dominic looked at me. I looked at him. I opened the folder, I turned it toward him, and I let him look at it for a moment. The tabs, the figures, the highlighted deposits, the running total at the bottom of the handwritten page. I said, "My attorney's name is Diane Marsh. She'll be in touch with your attorney when you have one." I closed the folder, and then I saw it. Just for a second. Just a flash of something that was not calculation and not performance. He looked at the folder the way someone looks at a photograph of themselves they've never seen before. Lost. Briefly, genuinely lost. He had revised the story so completely, for so long, that seeing the actual accounting of it was like meeting a fact he had decided wasn't real. I felt something for him in that moment. I want to be honest about that. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something in the neighborhood of understanding. He had built himself on top of what I had built, and standing in that room, he could see the foundation for the first time, and it was not what he had told himself it was. That is its own kind of reckoning. It is not mine to carry for him, but I saw it. I picked up the folder. I said, "I hope you figure out who you actually are." And I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking garage on the 3rd level on the east side, under the lights that buzzed slightly, for 19 minutes. I know it was 19 because I looked at the clock when I got in and again when I was ready to drive. I did not feel victorious. I want to be clear about that. I felt hollowed out in the specific way you feel when you have been carrying something heavy for a very long time and you have finally, carefully, put it down. Not relief yet, just the unfamiliar sensation of your own empty hands. I texted Petra. Done. She texted back a single word. Soup. I laughed. Alone in a parking garage, under buzzing lights, with an empty folder on the passenger seat, I laughed. It was the first real thing I had felt in days. I did not watch what happened to Dominic the way you watch something you caused. I want to be clear about that distinction, because it matters to me. Not for the story's sake, but for my own. I did not engineer his consequences. I did not make calls. I did not compose messages to people who knew him. I filed the paperwork, I worked with Diane, and I went back to my life and let his life be his own problem. But in a city the size of ours, in a hospital community the size of that one, information moves the way water moves, not because anyone forces it, but because it finds the available channels and flows. My mother called me on a Sunday, about 6 weeks after the consultation room, the way she always calls on Sundays. She had heard something from a woman she knew who had a daughter in nursing at Mercy Regional. She didn't editorialize. She just said, "People are talking about what he said at that dinner." I asked her how she knew about the dinner. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Someone told someone. You know how it goes." I did know. I had grown up in a town where everyone knew your name, and half of them had already decided what it meant. The mechanics were familiar. What I heard, through the slow, reliable channel of Petra and her network, and the woman my mother knew. Dominic had attempted, in the weeks after I filed, to tell a version of the story in which he was the reasonable party, and I was someone who had overreacted to a small social misstep. He said it to a few colleagues. He said it at a coffee station somewhere, the way he had said things at coffee stations before. The problem was Sylvia Harn. She didn't say anything dramatic. She didn't make a speech. What she did was quieter and more effective than that. She simply did not agree. When the version was offered to her, and it was offered to her, because people offer things to the person with the most institutional standing and wait to see what they do with it, she said, in the specific neutral tone of a woman who has been precise her entire career, "I met his wife. She seemed like someone who had done a great deal." That was it. That was all she said. But in the language of that room, in that community, the word "had done," past tense, specific, weighted, was a complete sentence. It confirmed what the folder had already documented. It said, without saying, "I saw the accounting, and I am not revising it." Dominic did not make attending at Mercy Regional. He matched elsewhere the following cycle. I heard this secondhand through Petra, who heard it from the nursing connection, and I sat with it for a moment the way you sit with information that you expected, and still feel something about. I did not celebrate. I went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept better than I had in 18 months. My brother Caleb called me 2 months into the process. He did not apologize, exactly. Caleb is not built for formal apology. He never has been. What he said was, "I should have asked more questions about how things were. I should have been less, I don't know, checked out." I said, "You weren't checked out. You were living your life." "Still," he said. "Still," I agreed. That was enough. For us, that was the whole conversation. We have talked every 2 weeks since then, which is more than we talked in the previous 4 years combined. He drove up from Columbus in November, and we had dinner at a Thai place near my new apartment, and he made me laugh 3 times in an hour, which is his specific gift. May sent me a card, handwritten, 2 paragraphs, in the careful script of someone who had thought hard about every word. She said she admired me. The word landed somewhere I hadn't expected it to. My mother was the last one. She called the Sunday after the settlement was finalized, and she said, not in the warm way, because she is not a warm woman, but in the way that is hers. She said, "You did the right thing. I want you to know I know that." I said, "Why didn't you say something? Before? You said you wondered when I'd see it." She was quiet for a moment. "Because you have to walk through the door yourself," she said. "If I'd pushed you, you'd have dug in. You know you would have." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Whether she was right. Whether the people who love us correctly are sometimes the ones who wait at the door, rather than drag us toward it. I'm still not entirely sure I forgive her for the waiting, but I understand it. And understanding is its own kind of arrival. There were people who did not come back. Friends who had become Dominic's friends in the slow, gravitational way that happens when one person in a marriage has more social pull than the other. The mutual friend from the birthday party where we met, she sent me a single text that said, "I heard. I'm sorry," and then nothing further. I did not respond. Not out of anger, because I understood that some people are sorry from a distance, and that's the full extent of what they have to offer. And accepting that without resentment is its own kind of freedom. I did not chase anyone. I did not perform my recovery for an audience. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city with tall windows and a radiator that clanked in the cold. And a second bedroom I turned into an office. I bought a plant for the corner of my desk. I made a dental appointment I had been putting off for 2 years. I called Petra on a Tuesday evening for no reason, and we talked for an hour about nothing important, which is its own category of necessary thing. About 3 months after the settlement, I sat down and I wrote Dominic a letter. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it was not what people might expect from that sentence. It was not a confrontation. It was not a recounting of grievances. It was not an attempt to make him feel what I had felt. I had documentation for all of that, and I had already used it for its proper purpose. The letter was short, 4 paragraphs. I am not going to read you all of it, but I will tell you what it said in its essential form. I told him that I had spent 6 years building something I believed was ours, and that I understood now it had never fully been. I told him that I did not think he was a bad person. I thought he was a person who had learned to protect himself by revising inconvenient things, and that I hoped, at some point, he would find the courage to stop doing that, because the version of himself he was building on top of the revision was going to require constant maintenance. I told him that what I had contributed was real, that it was documented, that it did not require his acknowledgement to be true, but that I wanted to say clearly, once, that I knew what I had done, that I knew its value, that no introduction, past tense or otherwise, was going to change the accounting. And then I wrote the last line, which was the only line Petra heard when I read it to her over the phone, because it was the only line that mattered. I wrote, "The work was real. I was real. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life acting like it." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's exactly right. Just that. That's exactly right." From a woman who does not give you more words than the moment requires, that sentence was everything. I folded the letter, I addressed the envelope, and then I thought about it for 3 days and decided not to send it. Not because it wasn't true, because I had written it for myself, and I realized I already had the only audience that mattered. I put it in the folder, the same folder, 6th tab, last page. Some things are complete without being delivered. I took the CPA exam in the spring. I passed on the first attempt. I am telling you that plainly because I think plainness is the right register for it. Not triumphantly, not as a corrective to anything. I passed because I was prepared, because I had always been capable of it, because Bev had told me twice, and Sylvia had told me once, and I had finally decided to tell myself. Dr. Harn's email arrived the week after I filed. She had written to me directly, not to Dominic, to me, at the address I had written on the notepad she'd passed around for dietary restrictions at the dinner. She said she had a contact, a medical practice group, partly owned by her husband's firm, that was looking for someone with my background and precision for a senior financial role. She said she enjoyed our conversation, and she said, simply, without elaboration, "I noticed the other night." For what it's worth, I notice. I read that email in the Hargrove and Dean break room at 8:14 in the morning. I did not cry. I sat very still for a moment, and I thought about a mason jar with $42 in it. I thought about a 12-year-old girl at a flea market who had not been asked to solve the problem, but solved it anyway. I thought about the specific quality of attention that Sylvia Harn had given me that night. Not pity, not performance, just the clean, honest regard of someone who looked at me and saw what was there. I thought, this is what it feels like to be seen accurately. Not celebrated, not rescued, seen. I emailed her back that afternoon. Professional, warm, brief. I said I was very interested. I said I appreciated her reaching out. I started at the practice group 14 weeks later. My desk is on the fourth floor of a building with a good view of the city's east side. On the corner of my desk, there is a succulent I have managed not to kill for 7 months, which I consider a personal achievement. On the shelf behind me, not displayed, not centered, not framed, sits a mason jar. Old coins, folded paper, $42 from when I was 12, from a flea market, from a problem I solved before anyone asked me to. I do not tell people what it is. I do not need to. It is there for me. Some mornings I drive past the road that leads to the old apartment, the one with the broken radiator in the first year, where I sat behind Dominic at the kitchen table doing data entry while he studied. I don't take the road, but I let myself see the turn. I let it be part of the route, not a wound, not a monument, just a place that was real, a time that was real, a version of myself that was doing the best she knew how with what she understood love to be. She deserves that. Not pity, just acknowledgement. She worked very hard. She kept excellent records. My name is Renata Cowell. I am 34 years old, and I know now that the work you do in the dark, the 5 a.m. doc, the midnight login, the folder with 6 tabs, the letter you wrote for yourself and kept, that work does not disappear because someone decides not to see it. It does not require a witness to be true. You were there. You know what you did. That's the whole record. That's enough. Before you go, I want to ask you something real. Because this story, at its center, is about the difference between being used and being unseen. And I'm not sure those are always the same thing. Dominic used what I gave, but what hurt most was that he stopped seeing me. And I wonder if you've ever been in a version of that, where the loss wasn't just what was taken, but the specific grief of being looked at by someone who knew you and finding that they'd stopped. If that's ever been you, I want to hear it. Leave it in the comments. Tell me the shape of it. I read every single one, and I mean that. Not as a script line, but as the actual truth of how I spend my Tuesday evenings. And if this story stayed with you, if Renata's folder, or her mason jar, or that one sentence from Sylvia Harn hit somewhere real, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the work they've done in the dark is still on the record. It counts. It has always counted. Thank you for being here with me for this. It meant more than you know.